This video is sponsored by Chakra 17. Awaken your vitality with our anti-aging coffee.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the monthly podcast with the one, the only aforementioned Mr. S.G. Anon, who you're all well aware, highly respected and honored here on our channel and many others. He's here to discuss all things financial and geopolitical per usual for the month of October, now that we're at the midway point, crossing over the Rubicon to the other side. If you're new to the podcast, please do like, subscribe, and share. It helps the channel grow and others to gain the knowledge you're currently being afforded. How are you today, good sir?
Fantastic, John. Thank you for having me back.
Always an honor, believe me. We always look forward to this. Okay, SG, let's hit it fast and furious. As you're aware, the historic peace meeting in Egypt occurred on Monday, Columbus Day, with the most influential nations in the Middle East being present. But what struck me the most was that Iran was there willing to make peace, at least on the surface. Do you think this time the peace agreement will in fact stick, as President Trump said, that this was the first time in 3,000 years that this event has occurred?
It's a very interesting question. I think a phenomenal question to get us started with, John. I would like to say that, yes, I am hopeful the peace will stick. And I want to qualify that statement by saying that there are certain entities online that we reference often on podcasts like this and others that have told us everything done twice. And so as we look at what's happening now, this is not simply a second version of the Abraham Accords. This is a completely new peace arrangement with completely new players involved and a lot of the other players from the old accords involved. It also features the establishment of a board of peace, which is supposed to be an international sort of semi-jurisdictional body in this area. And when we look at the infestation of the globalist deep state cabal, and we can qualify what that is, until the cows come home, but for purposes of our discussion here, this is a insular group of closed systemic forces that have a great deal of sway in finance, business, and governmental political markets worldwide. If we're going to drag that entire infestation out, it may require some testing of that board of peace. It may require some testing of what's happening in the Middle East. And as we look at the changeover that has occurred in the financial sector especially, which is now becoming far more obvious, even Tucker Carlson, with an audience of over 200 million, talking openly and actively about a financial reset coming to the entirety of the international financial marketplace. When we look at that transitioning and moving forward in very real time, it stands to reason that what resistance remains to that is going to have to show itself before too long, because the progress happening in favor of rebalancing and reorienting those worldwide markets is happening now so rapidly. So it's a long answer to your question. I'm cautiously optimistic that we will have overall peace with all of this, but I think that we also need to appreciate the wild cards and the joker cards that occasionally come into play. And that's why I think we need a strong commander-in-chief at the helm to tackle those challenges should they arise.
Well, thankfully, we have that SG and then some. And as you know, part of the prosperity is getting the peace. So they go hand in hand. I want to show you a quick article here that kind of supports what you were talking about. Let me know when you can see this on screen. This is from Gold Telegraph, as earlier today. Suddenly, many in the crowd who thought what once was called a, quote, monetary reset was a conspiratorial tinfoil fantasy now think that's exactly where the world is headed. Interesting, the vindication. So taking that article against what you shared about Tucker Carlson, did you happen to notice, SG, that President Trump spent time off and on camera during that peace agreement in Egypt, primarily, or I should say heavily focused with Prime Minister Soudani of Iraq, and he even pointedly commented that they have plenty of oil and that we will talk soon. Doesn't that seem to imply that he is going to give them the optical date to pull the trigger on the dinar? And if so, just in your own speculative nature, when might you surmise that would happen?
Well, it's very fascinating. I think the latter part of the question might be above my pay grade. There's a lot of forces that go into that, but I think, by December of this year, certainly we should have some sort of progressive obviousness if we're going to look at a 3.6 forecast for GDP growth beginning in January and going through the end of next year. But, it's very interesting. I think that with that particular meeting, and it was so obvious that there was a deep friendship, a deep appreciation from Prime Minister Soudani to President Trump, the way that he held his arm, the way that he held his hand, this was, and the way that he came in very close and President Trump allowed him into that closed space. It wasn't merely arm's length. You had bent elbows, which signals trust and cooperation and coordination. This was a true I think, impressive meeting, but because it is, again, related to such a sensitive component of this overall Great Awakening, this overall cultural battle that has gone from the Western world sort of outward across the entirety of the planet over the last 5 years, it's very likely that they have to be extremely close to the chest and extremely reserved until we get more indication on how soon the timetables look with respect to the internal Iraqi economy now taking on the international scaffolding of trade and commerce. And I think as we look at the War Department's press releases over the entirety of the Iraqi mission over the last 12 months and some of the advisory groups that are now being recalled from governmental levels just in the last 120 days, this would make a great deal of sense that we're approaching go time, because it would be those very pulpits of influence, knowledge, and power that would be able to undo what the former Department of Defense did in Iraq beginning in 2003.
Agreed. And to your point, SG, as you know, just from a practicality standpoint of economics, you talk to any economics person 101, if you're going to see the realization of an economic shift in a quarter, it has to take place the quarter prior. So if we're going to see it in realization for the world in January, for example, it has to happen in this quarter. And we reference back President Trump, I think it was in August at the Oval Office, he said, by December, January, the economy is going to be rocking. Well, that has multiple implications, this being, I think, one of them. SG, many retail investors on the crypto side were concerned about the market absorbing significant losses last week, and yet it's clawed back some of its losses already. People forget often that if you hodl and don't sell, you actually don't lose. Wasn't this pullback sort of a final effort by the deep state factions to flush out buyers on fear porn, the crypto space, right before they send the crypto bull run, as we're anticipating this to happen? And let's not forget ISO 20022 on the digital ledger technology goes live November 22nd.
Well, I just want to remark on that particular date, and it's very interesting that you brought that up. That's the anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so what is so incredible about this, again, it makes me laugh sometimes, John, the symbolism is beyond mathematical impossibility from a stance of just total random chaos and coincidence. It is organized and coordinated in a way to drive out exactly what you referenced a moment ago, those problematic actors that still exist in these market spaces, in these financial spaces. There's still a lot of money out there held by questionable individuals. I think all of us can acknowledge that. All we have to do is turn on any form of information consumption anywhere in the world to see that. But at the same time, those entities, those influences, those overall, what I would even characterize as from a frequency standpoint, low wavelength operative mechanisms and individuals are being sort of driven out of their old system through the very fashion that we've seen in ways prior. The crash, repeat, inflate, tax, inflate, crash, steal, repeat, that sort of cycle going back literally decades now in the American stock market system. We can take it all the way back to the crash of 29 and even before to see that pattern every 10 to 25 years or so. And now we were seeing elements of that pattern, excuse me, applicable areas of that pattern that are very highly exposed to those same elitist institutions and elitist ultra high net worth levels that are being sort of run up the flagpole in the same mechanism. And I view the recent hiccup in the crypto space as just one example of that. It would not surprise me if we see an additional hiccup in the crypto space as we go forward, because again, we are attempting to blend the ecosystems between physical commoditized commerce and the digital representation and tokenization of the same across the entirety of the international framework. And so it would make sense that we would have to shake that tree maybe 1, 2, and maybe even 3 times as we go through that process, just to be sure that all of the fruit that we carry over into this new tree that we're building and blending and creating over here onto the side is prosperous and contributes to the abundance and the health of the organism as a whole rather than to its detriment.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, SG, with the 22nd. Future proves past once again, as Q said. So we can't ignore the gigantic elephant in the room too, SG, with respect to the precious metals markets. While cryptos have been fluctuating along with the stock market and the S&P 500, gold and silver are charging ahead like a locomotive train on a mission. Silver is, as you know, up over 56% since January to all-time highs since 1980. Currently, I think today, as of the time of this podcast, silver's now 52.27. And gold is over 42.1920. How high do you think gold and silver can go up the remainder of this year? And do you see President Trump revaluing gold to 20K or higher by year's end or maybe first quarter next year?
Well, it's very interesting. I don't want to speculate on price points, but I can say that it seems based on the pace of growth just in the last 45 days. Let's take silver as alone for an example. Silver has gained $10 in value in that time frame. So this is a basically 6.5 week period of time. That's a extremely rapid pace of growth. And I think one of the wild cards out there that a lot of people don't talk about as often anymore because it sort of hiccuped in the space. It was very popular for a flash moment instant, and then we moved on to the next major focus in the cycle. But this Fort Knox audit has still not come out. And so as we look at potentially releasing that or whatever results or next steps documentably come from that, it may be appropriate and necessary for the government to examine things like a fixed weight of gold or silver and to establish a standardized value mechanism. A revaluation is what you said just a moment ago, but a new standard value mechanism for these underpinnings as a potential hedge against something like the hyperinflation and eventually the pop of something like the fiat dollar. And I'm not a financial advisor, and I'm not sure how these events would all dovetail together. But as we look at the pace of these events, it would not surprise me to, again, see momentum on this issue by December or January. That seems like a relevant time frame. It seems appropriate given that next July is the 250th anniversary of the Republic for the United States. We know that President Kennedy was assassinated for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons was the executive order he signed ordering the Treasury to begin designing a new monetary exchange system internally inside the nation based on a fixed weight of silver. And we have a tremendous amount of silver that has been acquired, and I do mean tremendous, hundreds of thousands of pounds of silver that have been acquired by the former Department of Defense, now the Department of War, over the last 8 years. And I believe, John, that it's going to be primarily for this purpose, as well as underpinning the industrial base needs for the military from a consumption standpoint. So the price of things as a result of all of these different factors now beginning to coalesce and converge, these international markets now beginning to reform and prepare themselves for clearly what is going to be a pretty tremendous transition. Iraq has a tremendous amount of value that they're going to bring to the table with gemstones, which is ancillary to the silver and precious metals issue. They also have oil and things of that nature. As we look at all of these coming together in this particular time frame, it would make a great deal of sense that we see something coming out of these official government audits and actions that are focused towards our nation's stockpile of precious metals, and a presidential or even perhaps a congressional action in response to that to sort of set us up again in this post-1971 landscape.
Yeah, good point. And interestingly enough, I had a conversation recently with a mutual alliance of ours, Kirk Elliott from Kirk Elliott Metals. He was teaching me that for every dollar that silver goes up, it shorts the banks 300 billion on their balance sheets with a B. So it's just hammering the deep state agenda, which obviously is part and parcel to the point. I'd also like to turn your attention now, SG, to this brief interview with Dr. Judy Shelton. Let me just cue this up here for posterity so we have it. And in this clip, she's talking about long-range treasury bonds ranging from 50 to 100 years in length. I'd like you and the audience to pay close attention to some of the key phrases that she uses within the discussion. So let's take a quick listen.
If the United States were to issue a gold convertible bond, say one running from July 4th, 2026 to 2076, how do you think that would change global demand for U.S. debt?
Well, I think it would really garner the world's attention. I mean, this would be the first time since President Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system in August of 1971 that under a different U.S. president, the world once again would see a United States willing to guarantee its debt against these reserves of gold that our country has. And we have 261 million ounces. I think that this would be an amazing signal that the United States is saying we need to have some kind of a rational international monetary system. I would expect other countries to emulate this U.S. example. And this would be very much in keeping with, frankly, what President Trump has always argued against, which is currency manipulation by trade partners. I mean, finally, you would have a level international monetary playing field. And I don't think you can really talk about free trade logically in the absence of a level international monetary playing field.
So did you catch some of the phrases? I'm sure you did. SG, currency manipulation, meaning currency revaluation. President Trump said that, in his first term in 2017. She talked about level playing field, assets in the ground, one-to-one, something real. Is she mirroring President Trump because he's going to pick her as his new Fed/Treasury chair? And is she advocating for gold as a standard for all monies, including cryptos, foreign currencies, bonds, as well as land?
Well, I think that's a fantastic clip of an interview to summarize really a great deal of what we've been talking about and a great deal of everything that has come together to make this moment in time possible. And when she said level the playing field, and she said it twice, a level international playing field, monetary playing field, that recalled to me the prime minister press conference that President Trump had with former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan in September of 2018, where he made a statement to the entirety of the world. I think it was his first presser statement of this sort, where he said, we are going to level the playing field and remove this currency manipulation. And so what that is the spear through the chest of the deep state corporate construct that has taken over the entirety of the planet by virtue of a debt enslavement banking system based on entirely nothing, a fictitious fake promise. It's all based on a lie. It's how these individuals have operated, and it's a form of their religious and idolatrous worship. It's how they go to church, for lack of a better characterization of it. And so that has been the difficulty, of course, over the hundreds of years that this has been in place, trying to unseat that, because it is such a devoted and such a zealotous, insular system. And so now this system in the last 8 years, John, has been broken open to such a fashion that it is reforming, it is transforming, it is completely reimagining itself from the inside out. This can only be an activation of the light inside the vestiges of the system that are not totally corrupt and captured, and assisted from an outside force. And I purport to say that that would be a worldwide military and civilian alliance existing primarily across political intelligence and military pulpits in the Western world to help unseat that religious power structure that has been in control of finance for so long. And so this is sort of a huge umbrella view answer to the question, but it comes back down to the question, is this person the next pick or not? I don't know as it necessarily matters whether she is. She has the credentials, the street credibility, the face recognition, the name recognition, and the know-how, along with the respect across the entirety of the political and financial landscape to affect the perception of investors, both institutional and retail, and to affect the perception of those individuals and influence figures across foreign boundary lines. And it's important to highlight international boundary lines that helps restore confidence in the American dollar system, confidence in what will eventually become the U.S. American Treasury note, in that confidence in what will eventually become the American economic landscape of investment and sort of blue collar work and industrial underpinning. And so this is a tremendous statement, and it does mirror President Trump in a way, but not because, in my opinion, this is the next pick or not, but because this individual was on board with the original mission that goes all of the way back to President Trump's initial presidential run in 2016 to begin with. And I just want to call the audience's attention to that excerpt from one of the very early on Q drops that stated, was POTUS asked to run for president of the United States?
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you, SG. Turning our attention a little bit to the geopolitical side of things, excuse me, Canada is in a continuous state of chaos, unfortunately, with President Trump meeting recently with Carney and confronting him, as you know. How, in your estimation, does Canada get fixed? Can they elect non-corrupt leaders that represent the interests of the respective citizens, or will they ultimately be resigned to becoming a 51st state of the United States of America under the Republic?
Well, that's very interesting. And again, it might be a little bit above my pay grade, but I think I could see it going either way, depending on what the Canadian population themselves elect to have and elect to do in this moment. I really do think that this is a fork in the road moment for the destiny of Canada as a national and cultural identity, and how integrated they want to be with the broader concept of all of us North Americans, right? And so looking at this landscape, we certainly know that it's already blended economically. We're essentially the same in many regards to the European Union based on the USMCA, but with a much more balanced and enforceable mechanism of support and coordination in the background. but we're also growing much closer culturally and I think nationally as a broader collective of people upon this continental shelf because of this information age that we all live in. And we predominantly share mostly the same language. You've got a heavy concentration, of course, of Spanish and some of the Asian languages in America. You've got a heavy concentration of English, Chinese, and French in Canada. So there's a little bit of a difference, but not a tremendous amount. And certainly the lifestyle choices are very similar when we look at the border regions and the ruggedness that is necessary to sort of tackle those arenas and terrains. And so I think it's very possible that we could see Canada, not necessarily as a whole international nation state coming into the United States of America all in one fell swoop, but we may very well see things like referendums over time. And that over time doesn't mean over generations. You could have these over a period of 4, 5, maybe 6 years. And those referendums may or may not go in the favor of some sort of unification or separation from a former entity and enjoyment with a new entity. And I think that's what President Trump's job really has been, not just with respect to the commander-in-chief component of all of this, not just with respect to the art of the deal component, the business maker, the peacemaker, but President Trump has also had a tremendous role, I think, in awakening the masses to the ideas of what is truly possible. You know, this is our planet Earth. This is, and as it pertains to the North American shelf, this is our quadrant of the Western Hemisphere. The same can be true of the South American patriots in their area. The same is true of all of the other patriots around the planet on all major continents. And so we are awakening and in entertaining in seriousness and in some cases in severity these concepts of changing the old ways in tremendous fashions. But we're also trying to spearhead a free will maneuver in that process. What do the people want when given a choice? They've never had a choice before. It's always been an elective selective situation. It's always been a sleight of hand. It's always been a look behind the curtain situation. There was never really a choice there before. And so now there is true free will. And I think what happens with the 51st state discussion will ultimately have to be a reflection of whatever that free will decides over a relatively short period of time.
Yeah, indeed. It's going to be interesting to see how that all plays out. And we're certainly praying for the good people of Canada going forward. SG, a couple weeks ago, President Trump on his own Truth Social account posted a deep fake AI video talking about med beds and the med bed cards that each citizen will receive. Later that day, the video was removed shortly after its release. When confronted by a reporter on the subject at a White House presser, Caroline Leavitt did not shy away from the question, even went on to say that she applauds the president's transparency with the American people and that the message did come directly from his Truth Social account. Was that their way of acknowledging that the med beds are legitimate? And if so, and I know this is a difficult question to answer, but when might you see, based on momentum with financial and everything else, that med beds might hit the public for use?
You know, that last part of the question is the question that is on the minds of most, if not all, of the American public. If there's one thing we all understand, John, it's that we've been very heavily poisoned and really incapacitated in ways that are just not cool. And so I think a lot of us are very, very interested in knowing that. I wish I had a good estimate. As it looks now, and as we look towards this great American fair that's going on in the background, which we're not really getting a lot of media coverage about at the present day and time, as we look at this upcoming 250th birthday celebration in July of next year, and the momentum that creates, as we look at and the momentum that will create, going forward, as we look at the timing with this decade, we're now in 2025, so we're halfway through a 50% line. The inflection point really is a good way to say that. When we look at any mathematical progression of integers, you have an inflection point at that 50% divide. I could very well see that happening anytime over the next 6 to 12 months. Let's just put it that way to be conservative. And I want to qualify that by saying it is speculation. I truly do not know. But I want to come back to the point of the question that you asked just a second ago. Was this confirmation or not? I would postulate a question for a question. How can it not be? President Trump has said many, many times, everything I said has happened. I've been right the whole time. Everything I've said, Trump was right. That was one of his big campaign, headline advertisements and one of his campaign appeals as he went through the 2022 to 2024 season, much like any candidate would. And we know a great deal of that, of course, was orchestrated by both law enforcement and military forces in the background to help drive home a particular point. So if this individual is now sharing what was at one point in time thought to be a crazy lunatic conspiracy theory from that weird uncle or that crazy aunt that comes to the dinner table, for a couple of times a year to sit down with the family. Now that's coming from the president of the United States, the commander in chief of the United States Armed Forces, who receives a PDB every day on the most actionable intelligence and things that are happening out there in the world, who literally created the Space Force. This is the guy that is now saying that medbeds are real and that there's going to be a way for the American population to participate in them going forward, and likely a way that is being built out or has already been built out digitally in the background, because it all has to be done through cyberspace. I think as we look at this, this post that came out from President Trump, there is a tremendous amount of hope and encouragement that patriots should feel. And I would even go so far as to say, who cares when the rollout actually truly is? I understand that there are people living with acute conditions and terminal conditions. I completely understand what it's like to live with tremendous pain. I had a severe spinal injury for over 36 months before it was finally resolved. And unfortunately, I had to resolve it through surgical means, but I had a good outcome from that regardless. But I guess what I'm saying is I understand the desire to get there. But when we have the president saying that it is coming, that we're doing this the right way, when we have the entity online saying, the Q entity online saying it has to be done right, it has to be done by the book, it must be permanent. The fix must stick. It cannot be a situation where we roll out life-changing, world-altering technology and a bunch of lunatic, greed-based goons get a hold of it and then attempt to hold the entire planet hostage over it. And that's exactly what we've had happen at many different points along the way over the last 500 years of technological and financial development. So I'm very enheartened, very encouraged by this, and I'm excited to see how this plays out in the lead up to and through that 250th birthday.
Agreed. At the same time, I am on the side of people with this in the aspect that, I'm very cognizant of my audience, the people that are suffering, and we're not, like you said, unsympathetic. While on one hand, it has to be done correctly and strategically, you're right. We cannot lose sight of the fact of the people that are suffering or we're losing during this time. And I think hopefully the sooner the better. But yes, I do think that you want to make sure that the bad guys don't get access to it. And I've had it confirmed by several military people we interview that enough of the good guys are overseeing this operation to root out the nefarious people and draining the swamp as part of that. With respect with continuation of the geopolitical side of things, now that the Middle East peace deal seems to be addressed, I think he's meeting with the actor counterpart of Zelensky on Friday, 17th, more comms there. When do you see this is a longer range question, SG, so bear with me here. When do you see the Russian-Ukraine conflict being squelched? And what about China with the 130% tariffs that now have been blocked by China prior to November 1st? Do you see both of these trade agreements being done before November? And then we have Israel, who's left for last. Is there a possible final potential attack on Iran's underground nuclear power plants like they did in June? Or was the Middle East peace deal enough to create a grave surrender to Iran?
Well, it's a really interesting set of questions and a lot of variables there, so I may have to take it in segments. Let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine part first, and we can come back to the Israeli part, because I think that's an involved enough answer with the Middle East that it becomes a question all on its own. The Russia-Ukraine landscape, in my opinion, John, is essentially twofold in nature. It is tying up the entirety of deep state finance, corrupt money, black market funnel markets, or funneling money markets for the entirety of Europe and the African shelf and the Mediterranean. It's having that effect. It's also having the effect of draining the old weaponry, the rogue weaponry out of the NATO construct of nations, and a lot of other black market supply chains around the entirety of the planet that, of course, have been feeding munitions and supplies to that Ukrainian side for about a year and a half now, at least, perhaps 2 years going on. We know that there's been an enormous armament trade that was created there, along with a concurrent biological pathogenic and biological agent trade that was created there. So there's a tremendous amount, of course, of human suffering that goes on as a result of that. Mass scale organized kidnapping of both children and adults, mass scale organized executions of various population groups for one ideology or another. And so all of this has been going on for a number of years but especially since the inauguration of this conflict in a more public way in 2022. And as I've looked at this conflict, I've thought a couple of different times along the way that we were approaching sort of a stalemate, for lack of a better term, or a position that was good for an exit to do an expose to the world, to get the world involved in what's happening here. But as I've continued to watch it spurn on, and as I've continued to watch President Trump purposefully do things to keep the conflict going, in the sense that there is a money drain, and a weapons drain, and a biological agent drain, and a very real cleanup operation happening at the behest of the Russian military. And when we saw President Trump's tune sort of shift on Ukraine a little bit, but not tremendously, but just a little bit enough that it made a difference in the reception and the narrative in the Western world, U.S. media, not just U.S. media, but the Western world media. And that happened right after his meeting with President Putin. I think what we have there is a tenuous element of the awakening that has yet to fully mature. It has yet to fully gestate. And I think it is concurrent with what's happening in finance markets, but I also believe it is concurrent with what's happening with respect to the awareness of and preparation of the mass public at large, the general population of the Western world, to see the types of criminality, the war crimes that have been committed by the Ukrainians against both the Russians, but also their own people, including civilians and children. And as we look at that connection, a lot of that corruption ties back financially to the deep state players that are immensely name recognizable inside the Western world, including Washington, D.C., London, Paris, all of these other areas. You've got tremendous amounts of money, certain tie-overs with respect to island visits with one another, and being photographed with one another on certain boats, for example, and things like that. And so there's a lot of this that I think is going to break not just break into the part of the narrative that deals with the biological agents, which of course is something the DNI Gabbard has already made very plain and clear that they are investigating, and that this is something that cannot be allowed to persist forward inside the operative U.S. Military and intelligence pulpits. But we're also, I think, preparing to begin to break open into the narrative, excuse me, at the mass population level, about the types of criminality that the Ukrainians have been engaged in, and that these co-opted forces inside the U.S. government have been engaged in. And I think, and if I may, on this particular issue, we saw the sister-in-law of one Mitt Romney take a 5-story fall for no reason just in the last 72 to 96 hours. We know that the Romney family, along with the Pelosi family, the Biden family, the McCain family, other families that are associated with these dynastic groups inside U.S. politics over the last 30 years, a lot of them have tie-overs to Ukraine for a number of reasons. And some of those reasons are really not so wonderful to talk about on broadcasts like this. And so this becomes an exposure operation as well as an awakening operation. And I think the true true dictator, if I can say it, if I can use that term, of what is actually going to happen with respect to the exposure of Ukraine is coming primarily from Moscow, because it is the Russians that are in that area of the world that are handling the types of corruption and the types of activities that have been going on, discovering these underground dungeon systems, these underground laboratory systems, cataloging them, removing biological agents and material from them, removing weaponry from them, removing dead individuals from them, all of these sorts of things. And so the Russians have sort of the nasty business of making this the record so that people can appreciate the darker aspects of what happened here that tie back to most of the political corruptive pulpits inside of the Western world. And I think President Putin's and President Trump's meeting in Alaska very likely covered some of that topic of what the progress is like. Where is the public at with this? Where are you at kinetically on the ground with some of this? And of course, we know some of it is CGI, so there is a bit of a component of that has to be put into the mix. How much of this do we take? How rapidly is the Russian population ready to accept this? Is the American population ready to accept this? What more do you need from me? These types of questions, I think, all affect that. And I think we should see a resolution to that conflict sometime again in the next 6 to 12 months, perhaps, and actually really probably the next 6 to 9 months, because it makes sense that we would want to save part of President Trump's presidency to celebrate his ability to make the peace. And he said numerous times that this was the conflict that he expected to be easiest to settle, and it turned out to be the most difficult.
Interesting. Well, since you fleshed it out per usual, SG, I guess a good follow-up question that I think is also on the geopolitical side, top of mind for a lot of people. President Trump has said we're going to have a great Christmas, and we talked about earlier about December, January, the economy will be rocking. But parallel that with the geopolitical side of arrests. And again, just your own personal analysis. Obviously, nobody knows exact time frame, but would you be encouraged to see possibly, we've got Comey's been indicted. I know Bolton's up on deck. Cash Patel, they met today. I think that's part of that. Isn't that leading down a path for the Clintons and Barry Soetoro to get arrested? Do you think there's a possibility that could happen by the end of the year?
I don't think that we see all of the way up to Barack by the end of the year, but I think we see enough of the pyramid going upwards towards that higher pulpit by the end of the year that the momentum is sort of self-descriptive and sort of manifestly obvious on its face. And I think Barack himself told us that just a couple of days ago. He was on some weird podcast it was all beige and taupe in the background, and he was sitting up on a couch dressed in all black in pants that were not long enough for him, and he was literally sitting up in sort of like a semi-vertical fetal position on the couch. It was actually very strange and odd. And as I looked at that, I realized this is either a scripted role position or this is someone who is positively and resolutely horrified at what is coming for them sometime in the very near future. Because as we see someone like Comey going down, and yes, is the indictment against Comey a little bit light? Of course it is. I think we talked about this on our last podcast together. But it provides the incentive for the canary to sing very loudly. And someone like Comey has tremendous amounts of actionable information, evidence-based information and knowledge, including locations, whereabouts, times, dates, context of certain discussions that occurred, individuals that may have been listening to discussions that occurred from a third party or fourth party angle. All of this can come from an individual as connected to the nexus as Jim Comey was. And we know that Jim Comey was in the office with Barack Obama when they approved treason. And that's really just what it boils down to. And when you look at the committal of a capital crime of that level, you always have to go from the top down. Who actually had the authority to approve the sequence of events that occurred that created the war crime, that created the treason, that created all of these different variables that we're seeing sort of fleshed out to the public on display over these last many months since President Trump came into office in the early part of this year? That goes back to the former president of the United States, the former vice president of the United States, and the individuals of the cabinet. And the cabinet itself is going to become another very interesting target in all of this. I think you're going to see cabinet members selling out former cabinet members, individuals that were involved in some of these activities who arranged, for example, the meeting between Joe Biden and some of the individuals in the Ukrainian government who arranged for the transfer of 1.8 billion US dollars to Kiev, cash money only, who arranged for all of these different, coordinated things that occurred internationally between China, who arranged for the trafficking of special access programs and design plans and specifications for U.S. fighter jets out of the United States and into Beijing and Shanghai, who arranged for that, right? These are questions that are going to come back to the core of the Obama administration, the advisors and the deputy advisors, or the deputies to the advisors for the president, and then the vice president pulpit and the president himself. And we may see Joe Biden exited stage left in this process. We know that the man died a long time ago, but for purposes of writing this historic record, we may very well see that exit sometime in the coming weeks and months, because we're seeing the pace of these investigations begin to ramp up in such a fashion that they're going to be pretty self-evident before this process goes on much longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. It makes sense that President Trump is working counterintuitive to the normal process per usual, that he's going bottom up instead of top down to get the information, because he knows the higher he goes up the food chain, people will give up the information to try to save themselves or cut some type of deal, but there will be no deals. I think they're going to find out. And that is the worst Barry Soetoro actor I've ever seen. I mean, if people think that's really him, they need to go see an optometrist ASAP. Last question for today, SG, to respect your time. We see the Department of War notice that change from the DoD, being fully funded as of today by President Trump, apart from the federal government. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, where's that funding coming from? Sure seems like Nesara to me. And then unsurprisingly, at the same time, our military is going after President Maduro of Venezuela directly at his underground base, rumored by potentially the 21st of this month, which would just be next week. Once that happens, do you see Humberto Gonzalez, the people's choice for president, who had the election stolen from him, returned back to him? And what implications does that have for not only the people of Venezuela in terms of peace and prosperity for their economy, but other nations who are undergoing the same corruption cleanout, such as Zimbabwe?
Well, I think that's a fantastic parallel between Venezuela and Zimbabwe for a number of different reasons. The intelligence community presence there from the Western world over the last half century being one of those reasons, very, very similar in nature, very similar in overall structure on the ground. And I think it's very possible that we do see the election in Venezuela go through some sort of Venezuelan constitutional process. And I'm not familiar with the intricacies of Venezuelan law, but whatever that process looks like for them, it could very well be seen through, annulled, perhaps returned out to the people for a referendum. Perhaps they, see the remainder of this government through, but they allow for a different type of election environment, perhaps administered directly by the Venezuelan military at the next opportunity. I think that there's a number of different fashions that could go. One of the things that I think is sort of, beyond question now at this point in time is that there's going to be some sort of Maduro removal or Maduro resignation as a result of all of this, what we're seeing, this conflict ramping up in the Caribbean. And I want to stress that with Venezuela in particular, the conflict that's going on is far more multidimensional than what we're being told. One of the boat videos that they released supposedly from the Department of War destroying a boat was completely fake and CGI'd. The boat itself would not, and the size of the boat that they described in their press conference where they released the video, and I think it was General Kane that released the video discussing the boat itself, but the description that they gave to the boat and then the weight that they stated that the boat was carrying, it's simply not possible for the size keel that the boat and the vessel had. And so as we look at what's happening there, there's a much deeper situation occurring. Maduro had one of those red folders after the catastrophe of COVID and the theft of the 2020 election in November of 2020. We saw Maduro in just a few weeks after that with one of those red folders. We've seen President Putin, we've seen Premier Kim with these folders, we've seen other individuals with these folders. And so that tells me that there is a particular role that they are playing to drive home a particular point. And in the case of Venezuela, I think the point is twofold. It's to return power back to the people of Venezuela in a free capacity, whatever that means for their society. And it's also to drag out U.S. corporate and back channel corruption, intelligence community corruption and infestation that has primarily been a massive vector for on and off continent human trafficking over the last 50 to 75 years. And so as we look at these interdictions that are happening in the Caribbean, these traffickers, of course, there's drug traffickers out there. Drug traffickers are trafficking not just drugs, but they're typically also trafficking people and weapons. Drugs themselves, unless they're just tremendous quantities in one load, they're not typically worth the type of risk necessary to go out over open international water to move them. But people are. Weaponry is. Armament trafficking, biological agent trafficking, these types of incredibly profitable and lucrative black market underbellies are worth going out and taking that risk for. And I think those are more of the interdictions that we're seeing. You and I think, had talked a little bit earlier, either on or off air, I forget which one it was, but we talked about a raid that had happened by U.S. Special Operations in early September. That raid occurred at the airport of St. Croix, which is 56.5 miles from Epstein Island. And it was not the only Special Operations quote unquote training raid that occurred in the Caribbean basin during the month of September. Right alongside the assassination of Mr. Kirk on the 10th of September, God rest his soul, and the tragedy that was for the American population. Happening right alongside that in the background was a U.S. 6th Fleet naval training exercise. And where was it happening? It was happening in Constanta, Romania, which happens to be the same city that played host to an orphanages program that the spouse of the late Mr. Kirk, Erica Kirk, managed and coordinated and oversaw in conjunction with the U.S. military in 2012, 2013, 2014 timeframe. So there are more things happening with respect to all of these geopolitical events, both inside the United States and externally around the world, with points of interaction between the United States, both politically and militarily. And I would submit that whatever is happening in Venezuela is going to provide a conduit to return power back to the Venezuelan people, to probably revalue some of Venezuela's internal resources, because there hasn't been a proper valuation of them in at least 40 years that we know of, and also to remove corporate corruption and third-party contractor corruption and U.S. back channel third-party former intelligence contractor corruption that is on the ground in the northern part of South America, making an absolute gobsmack of money on trafficking people, armaments, and biological agents.
Well, firstly, I don't know about anybody else, but I'm always fascinated to listen to break down all of these different puzzle pieces and how they all intersect and intertwine. And your recall of historical knowledge and how things connect is frankly fascinating. It's a joy to listen to and watch. Interesting side note, SG, to your points, Venezuela was formerly the fourth largest economy in the world. So restoring that back, bringing purchasing power back in a significant way to the Bolivar with all the assets in the ground is going to be great for the entirety of the world and moreover their people. Also, an interesting side note, as you probably know, the Nobel Peace Prize this year was given to none other than Marina Corina Machado of Venezuela, who was formerly thought to be one of the people's choices for president prior to Humberto Gonzalez. So, I know some people feel like President Trump was snubbed, but the personal belief that he's working with her in cahoots behind the scenes for this very reason, and he'll get his just desserts for the world to see at a later appropriate date. So as we close this podcast, as always, SG, thank you for all of your wonderful contributions. Last thoughts you have for the audience, and where can people find your work?
I can be found in the same 4 places still online. If people would like to listen to the Q News Patriot podcast, they can find it on Rumble. It's on rumble.com/user/Q News Patriot. I'm not on Rumble by the name SG Anon, but I am on Truth Social and X by the name SG Anon. On True Social, it's in the handle. It's at real SG Anon, REAL SG Anon with a red check mark. On X, the handle is the THEQ News Patriot with a blue check mark and a username of SG Anon. And I can be found on Telegram at t.me/real REAL Q News Patriot. I'm not on Telegram by SG Anon either. My final thoughts, John, I think would be right alongside the overall flavor of what we've talked about today. We are winning in such massive and enormous gravitational, generational ways that the opponent that we're facing for the first time does not know how to respond. That's why we have the disturbances that we have that don't seem as coordinated as they once were. It's why we have the conflicts of narrative across different law enforcement institutions, both captured and non-captured. It's why we have differences of narrative coming from now inside the Democrat Party. It's why we have this sort of foundering that's happening inside the progressive liberal space, the very far left progressive liberal space across the entirety of the Western world. It's why we have the resurgence of national populism across all of Europe. I mean, Europe, for goodness sakes. This is a continent that has been self-integrating itself for 400 years. And now they're taking back their national identity. They're claiming who they are again in spirit and in truth. And it's really something that is just incredible to watch. And yes, there are painful moments. There are resistant moments. There are moments where those disturbances from the opposing side, as we usher them out the door, they smack us around on the face, or they scratch us, or there is a bit of a tussle that is going on now. And I think we can all see that both at the political level, but at other levels as well. But the whole point, the whole upshot of it, the whole reason for the tussle itself is because for the first time, they're no longer masters of the game board. For the first time, there's not a kill switch that's attached to us where they can just press a button and the fight is over. They have to fight this out with us now. And they're losing, John. And they're going to continue to lose because God has already won this battle.
Perfectly stated. Thank you, SG, for all those details. And folks, on our side of things, you heard SG say it himself. Tucker Carlson with an audience of over 200 million people. We showed you Gold Telegraph, the godly global financial reset, not the great reset, but the godly global reset is definitely in position now, and time is running shorter by the day as it comes more front and center to the public at large. So if you have currencies or you're looking to add to the cache of what you have, dinar, dong, Vietnamese dong, Venezuelan bolivar, we just talked about, or Zimbabwe bonds, and all the rest of the remaining 209 countries and provinces, We have a great company for that, which we will leave that link below here directly in the video. SG Anon, thank you for joining us, good sir. We always appreciate the time. Have a blessed rest of your day and the rest of the week, and we look forward to talking with you in the near future.
Thank you, John. God bless all.
God bless.